Well, today marks the first day of a 3-year trial for British Columbia, a trial that will temporarily decriminalize the possession of illegal drugs. Now, it will only apply to small amounts of opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA, but it did require a criminal code exemption from Ottawa, and the hope is that the pilot will lead to better health outcomes and ultimately save lives. To talk about this, we're now joined by Caitlin Shane. She is a lawyer with the Pivot Legal Society in Vancouver. She leads the organization's drug policy campaign. Ms. Shane, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, correct me if you disagree, but it seems for both the province and for the federal government, decriminalizing possession is about destigmatizing drug use. How does that improve health outcomes? And I know that's discussed among those who are more familiar with the issue, but for those who have questions about this policy direction, what would you say?
I think that it is correct to say that decriminalization will help to destigmatize drug use and in turn to help remove drug use from underground. So what we know is that criminalization drives drug use underground, leads people to use drugs alone and in isolation, and it also leads to frequent incarceration of people who possess small amounts of drugs, frequent interactions with police that can be harmful with people who use drugs. And so the idea behind this policy is to reduce some of that stigma, to allow people to have legal access to supervised consumption sites and overdose prevention sites that they're currently encouraged to go to, but have no legal means to access them. If you travel from home to a site with drug in hand, technically up to this point, you've still been criminalized. So the idea behind this policy is to allow for that and to help to remove some of the harmful interactions with police from the lives of people who use drugs.
And in doing so, reduce some of the harms, including perhaps saving lives for those who do use drugs.
I think it's important not to overestimate the outcomes of this policy. The fact that people will no longer be criminalized for possessing small amounts of drugs doesn't mean that overnight they're going to have access to a regulated, safe supply. Government has been very clear that they are not interested in legally regulating illicit drugs on a larger scale, and that's a shame because it is the illicit drugs and the criminalization behind them that leads to the numbers of overdose that we see. So really this policy is about reducing some stigma, allowing people to have the legal ability to access harm reduction sites that they're encouraged to visit already, and reducing the rate of incarceration, which we see most heavily being enforced against poor and racialized communities.
Okay, well, let's build on that by breaking up a couple of the points that you mentioned there. First and foremost, let's talk about the actual legal limit here, because if part of this is about reducing police interaction, the legal limit under this exemption is 2.5 grams. Does that concern you in any way, that is the limit?
Absolutely, it concerns me. Importantly, it's a cumulative threshold. So it means that in total, one can possess up to 2.5 grams of certain substance. What is important to note is that in the development of this policy, there were a number of groups of people who use drugs, legal experts, medical professionals, health authorities, all whom advocated for a much higher threshold quantity. It appears that police have been pushing very hard. They wanted a 1 gram threshold quantity. And so that's sort of the middle ground that we ended up with. The issue with that is that it presumes a person who uses drugs who has regular access to their dealer. If you're speaking with folks in rural and remote communities who don't have regular access to their supplier, people with mobility issues who need to purchase larger quantities at one point in time rather than more frequent engagements, people who rely on others to buy for them, for all of these groups of people, the policy won't protect them. If you have a policy that you believe is good and you think it will extend benefits to people, then you should be aiming to have that policy protect as many people as possible. And the problem with the 2.5 gram threshold is that it leaves out so many people, including arguably the people who need the benefits of decriminalization most.
Quickly running time, but I do want to get two more questions with you, if that's okay. And one has to do with an issue that you raised, the idea of a safe drug supply. For people who, again, are walking into this issue and this debate right now, what would a safe drug supply look like compared to what exists right now?
Right now, we have virtually no safe supply, except the supply that people can access through prescriptions. That's a highly regulated, very narrow way for people to access drugs. The idea behind prohibition is that you are actually relinquishing all control over illicit substances by turning a blind eye to the fact that people always have, always will, want and need to use drugs. You ignore the fact that supply will always meet that demand. And because the federal government and provincial governments have all but refused to provide any sort of legal avenue to a regulated safe supply of drugs, a consistent supply, a supply that has been standardized, you make room for a very robust illicit market that is profit-driven, that has no form of regulation, and that is the substance that people are accessing, and that is what is killing people.
So this pilot will run for 3 years then. It will be reviewed thereafter. What do you hope then comes out of this? Given the limitations as you see them, as you explain them to us, what do you hope comes out of this 3-year pilot program?
I hope that we start to see benefits in terms of people who use drugs who are protected by this policy, experiencing less stigma, being able to have more open conversations with their families, friends, doctors, less incarceration, less targeted incarceration of poor and racialized people. And I would hope that in looking at those benefits, we can move to extend the policy so that it applies to a greater range of substances and a larger number of people.
Caitlin Shane, really appreciate the time tonight. Thank you for it.
Thank you so much.